The Prime Minister returned from his state visit to the US, complete with a lavish dinner and numerous photo opportunities with the President. Next, he'll be travelling to China as the first Australian Prime Minister to visit in 7 years, despite Australian citizens remaining detained in the communist country under dubious charges. He'll then head to the Pacific Islands before again returning to the US for more diplomatic summits. So as he prepares to jet off yet again, we are left to deal with the possible rate rise from the Reserve Bank next week, a rental crisis that sees vacancy rates at their lowest levels, record numbers of migrants putting strain on healthcare and housing, and a housing cost burden at a 40-year high. So the question is it time the Prime Minister puts down the passport and starts doing something at home? Well, to discuss, let's bring in Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand and Director of Headline Advisory Andrew Carswell. Welcome to you both.
G'day, Sharri.
Of course, this first trip overseas came right after The Voice. Joe, yep. So do you think Albanese is doing enough to tackle problems at home? And I didn't mention there the problem of anti-Semitism, but of course that is a major one that I personally don't think the Prime Minister's showing leadership on.
Well, look, I think he has been unequivocal in saying that he is firmly against Hamas. He was pressed on this when he was in Washington, and they said, it doesn't look like your government's taking sides here. He was being accused of being too pro-Israel, if you like. And he said, yes, I am taking a side. I'm taking a side against Hamas. And he was very, very strong on that. So I think he has been pretty clear. Others in the party, I'll grant you, have been far less so, and that is disappointing. Look, he has to do these things. I mean, again, we're talking about the Israel question. Israel only exists because it's got America standing behind it, which gives you an indication of how important American solidarity or being allied to America is. Australia, of course, would not exist in its current form were it not for America. We would be a colony.
Well, Israel does have its own ability to defend itself.
It absolutely does, and it's fought incredibly well, as we know, in the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, and of course the War of 1948, where it established itself. But again, it is in very large part that it has Israel standing. That it has America standing behind it, that it's got those two aircraft carriers there. That means that the entire Middle East doesn't just jump on top of it. So it is. So that is the first thing to say. So these relationships are extremely important. Australia is in not a similar situation with China, but we know that there's been Chinese aggression and belligerence. We also know that it's hashtag it's complicated because they are our largest trading partner, and if they cease to exist, our economy would collapse in its current state. So we need to have that balancing out where we have a good, strong economic relationship with China, but that is backed up by a strong security relationship with the US, who is our most important ally by a country mile. And that means that we can then take a stronger line on China on their human rights abuses and other things.
All right, let's bring in Andrew Carswell. Washington was Albanese's 17th overseas trip in about 18 months. Do you think he's avoiding being in Australia?
No, I'm generally okay with his travel schedule. I think these as Joe said, they're important meetings, and particularly the Washington meeting where AUKUS is at a bit of a crossroads, and there's some awfully difficult questions that need to be posed and addressed. So I'm all for it. I'm all for him from going to China too. But when you're overseas as Prime Minister, you need to keep one eye on what you're achieving overseas and one eye back in Australia. There are some important issues here that need to be addressed, but the issue we've got is that it appears that it's a one-man band at the moment, and when Anthony Albanese goes overseas, no one steps up here. Like, where is Jim Chalmers this week? Where was he last week? Where is the Deputy Prime Minister? Who's talking about housing? Who's talking about migration? There is a void here of information because Anthony Albanese wants the attention and the spotlight on him. And even Anthony Albanese himself's not addressing those questions when he goes overseas. For instance, when he was in India, he was asked a question on domestic politics and refused to answer it and said, I'm only answering questions on these international issues. So there's a real problem there. And it's not like the government is, in storm waters, or it's not like the government's about to cast itself on the rocks. It's like the ship's been pulled into a bay and they've dropped anchors. They actually don't know where they're going.
Joe, look, on something a bit lighter, the Victorian government has defended its decision to decriminalise public drunkenness ahead of Melbourne Cup Day. I actually didn't know public drunkenness was a crime.
Criminal offence, that's right.
But nonetheless, and they've announced sobering up centres, but they're saying they're not; those centres
not ready.
aren't
That's
going to be ready. I mean, isn't that just a waste of money?
Sobering up centres are like the Commonwealth Games of public drunkenness. And again, if you're going to decriminalise public drunkenness, is Melbourne Cup Day really the best day to do it? Like, I mean, you've got, like, wouldn't you want to just start small and work your way up instead of going great to the sort of legs akimbo, upside down in the bushes brigade? But look, I just cannot wait to see where this ends up. In New South Wales, they say that everything went downhill ever since they got rid of the old drunk tanks, you know, where you just throw your local Irishman in there and wait for them to sober up and then they'd go home and everything would be fine again. I don't know how this is going to work. I'm pretty sure it's been a long, long time since someone was formally arrested and processed through the courts for public drunkenness. Anyway.
I know, it seems so bizarre. Andrew Carswell, but also sobering up scent. I mean, maybe just make them watch Parliament on television for a couple of hours and they'd sober up pretty quickly. It just seems such a waste of money, especially when Victoria has massive budget problems, to spend money setting up sobering up centres. Send people home.
It seems a little bit bizarre, but the funny thing out of all this story is that what do you do if people say no? I mean, you can't enforce them to go to this sobering up centre and make them lie down in a bed. You can't actually force that. So how is it going to work? But I do find this interesting being in Collingwood too. I think that says everything that needs to say about Collingwood.
But do they get their own room? Or are they all drunk in a room together? And if they get their own room, then use the facilities for homelessness instead, because that is actually needed.
Well, if they're all in the same room, all they're going to do is pick up.
Oh, God. What a thought.